Well, thank you, Franck, very much for the invitation. It's an absolute delight to be here. Thank you all for coming out. This is actually my first time in California, so it's an extraordinary experience for me just to be here and get a sense of the vegetation in this extraordinary place. That's really the first thing that struck me, was the air smells completely different here, and there's just it's so green, it's so beautiful. So that's just a wonderful situation to find yourself in. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about my background and who I am and where I came from, and hopefully that'll lead up to where I am now. So as Franck said, my profile is probably somewhat eccentric with regards to the sorts of upbringings that a lot of composers have. So I'm Canadian. I'm from a small town in Ontario originally. A small town where no new music of any sort whatsoever has ever been heard. I'm quite sure of it. And I actually moved to Toronto with my parents when I was 8 years old. So I mostly grew up in Toronto. And I was immediately, from a very early age, instinctively fascinated by all sorts of things about music. And one of the things that struck me the most was I was totally fascinated by instruments and by the way that instruments work and trying to figure them out. But without really any particular sense of their past or their historical origins or anything like this, or what they might actually be used for. So it was very much like I was in some kind of gigantic pawn shop type of situation where I would discover instruments randomly that had absolutely nothing to do with each other, and then try to do something with them. So that was really how I started out. So to give you an example, my father actually was at one point I think in the early 80s or something, he was interested in early music, which is great. So that was really nice. There's a lot of harpsichord music in the house. So at one point in the 1970s, it was possible to buy a clavichord kit. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. So there's a company, I can't remember what it's called, that actually sold clavichords and harpsichords and virginals and spinets in a sort of kit format. It's like IKEA sort of thing, where there'd be these flat-packed clavichords. So you'd get this thing and assemble it yourself, essentially, and you'd have to finish it and build it and all this sort of thing. So my father had a clavichord, and he used it briefly, I think, the main thing was building it. I think after he actually finally got the thing built, because it took quite a long time, he actually got completely sick of it, and that was that. So it was just gathering dust in the basement. So I pulled this thing out, not really knowing what it was, this clavichord, and started trying to do things with it, and so on and so forth. So I was walking home from school one day, and there was an old vintage synthesizer that someone was throwing out, a sequential circuits synthesizer, just lying there in the curb. So I pulled it home and tried to make it work and do something with it. And everything was like this. It was completely random. There's absolutely no sort of methodical aspect to this whatsoever. So at the same time, I was taking cello lessons, oboe lessons, and I was starting to study a little bit of music theory. But my first encounter with music was really this kind of sort of junkyard, sort of random approach, where it's just completely detached from any context, and you just find these things, and here they are, and you try to do something with them. So I was really fascinated with that sort of aspect of making music, just the instrument and the possibilities that are contained within an instrument. That was something that really struck me with a great deal of force. And so what I would do was, I was so desperate to create something, because I had a primal sort of, I don't know how to describe it, a devouring urge, really, to create things. And it was so powerful, I literally could not do it. So, but I didn't have any technique yet, because I was 14 years old. You don't know anything when you're 14. You literally know nothing, right? So what the hell, what am I going to do with all this stuff? So I would, at my high school, there were kids that could maybe play a couple of notes on a flute or something, or a tuba or whatever, a trombone. And I would sort of, I would fool them into coming home and work with them and try to get them to do things with me. And, it'd be like, you can kind of, produce a couple of notes on the trombone. So sit here and play the C sharp for whatever. That kind of thing. And I would record it. And I went all over Toronto trying to find whatever cheap recording equipment I could afford at the time, like really, really basic stuff. And making these tapes, I made thousands of recordings over the span of, I guess, about 6 or 7 years in my parents' garage. So those were my illustrious beginnings. And every time I would do something, I would be critically aware that the ratio of that which I could do versus that which I could not do was extraordinarily not in my favor. So with each new project, I would try to expand my capacities and my abilities to some degree. So, and it's just continued. So, I'd start out with whatever basic, random, strange things that I had available to make something with, and I would try to do something. And then you get a little bit better at it, and you get slightly better equipment, you get slightly better technique, your hearing gets better, and so on, and sort of went on from there. So that's miles away from the composer who starts out at a conservatory. And that has certainly colored my approach to music in a very significant fashion for my entire career so far. So I always start with the instrument. That's absolutely crucial to me. That is my bread and butter. That's my life's blood, really, is the instrument and the possibilities contained within. So that has probably cured me of any latent tendency towards abstraction in terms of how I elaborate my music. So the stuff that I do, whatever qualities it might have, it's very much predicated on immediate, concrete things. And that's what I've always tried to develop. So my approach is actually quite simple and quite empirical. So I start with a given situation, which usually starts out with an instrumentation of some kind. And then I start just thinking about what I could do with these instruments. What could I do that would be the most fantastic thing, given this set of instruments? So because I'm also extremely fascinated by musical instruments in general, and I'm always interested in hearing new sounds and new types of instruments, then each new project is different because I'm always working with non-standard instrumentations for the most part. I don't really have a lot of sort of normal Pierrot-type pieces. So we know what the Pierrot Lunaire kind of idea is, right? The flute, the clarinet, and so on, the violin and cello, and that kind of instrumentation, which has never actually appealed to me, even slightly. So in situations where I've been perilously close to having to write something along those lines, I've always found a way to pervert it. So for example, I wrote a piece when I was living in Spain, which I'll talk about briefly a little bit later, that is vaguely along those lines, but there's just enough sort of strange business going on in the instrumentation that it colors it differently. And so sometimes it's a question of just changing one instrument, or instead of using the sort of ubiquitous B-flat clarinet, you write for an E-flat clarinet. It could be something really simple like that, but you find a way to create a timbral situation that is really unique and unusual. So that's pretty much how I started, and I became completely obsessed with composition when I was around 18 or 19, and was desperate to find out everything that I could about it. So when you're 18 or 19 and you live in Toronto, that spells trouble, because there wasn't a lot of contemporary music being performed there at the time, and the contemporary music that was being played was not particularly broad in terms of what you could hope to hear in a concert. And the stuff that I was really interested in was the sort of post-war European avant-garde. And you could just forget about hearing anything like that. It just wasn't going to happen. So, to give you an example, I mean, my approach was totally naive and instinctual, but I became really, really fascinated by pieces like Gruppen by Stockhausen. And I actually saved up and bought the score, which was really something at the time. So, and I took it home and stared at it for weeks, trying to understand how this thing was put together and what it meant and what he was trying to do. And I listened to the recording. I bought the Abado recording, which is certainly not the best one that exists, but anyway. And I was just fascinated by this thing. And I had similar experiences with Boulez's Second Piano Sonata, for example. And a little bit later on, I discovered spectral music and things like that. And each time, it was like an industrial force magnet pulling me away towards something else, and I had to go. So I formulated this project very early on that I would have to leave, and I would have to go somewhere else. And that's a strange kind of compulsion. Growing up in what is, by all accounts, one of the nicest countries in the world, where there's no tension, where very few bad things ever happen. We're not involved in any particular calamities in Canada. It's one of the most neutral places in the world. And voluntarily stepping out of an extraordinary situation to be born into, and putting myself in a completely different context where I knew nothing. And that was an absolutely unquenchable desire that I had. So it was difficult, but I had to do it. And so I showed up in France in 2003. I was 22 years old. I spoke rather poor French at the time, and I knew nobody when I arrived. I was very fortunate to have some support from my parents. I'm very grateful to them for having done that. But I really didn't know anybody, and it was like being on Mars. So I arrived there, and I just started listening to all sorts of things and going to a lot of concerts and meeting people and exchanging, and it was unbelievably stimulating. So I came, I suppose you could say, slightly late to the quote-unquote new music world. I'm actually not sure that I belong to it now, for that matter. In fact, I probably don't. But at any rate, it wasn't an obvious thing for me to step into that world. It was actually it required a radical shift of context. So I was instinctively fascinated by this post-war music. I wanted to understand how it worked, and I wanted to understand where it led and where we might be today. So that's pretty much what happened. So I'd like to talk about a couple of pieces of mine that maybe will give you an idea of what I'm up to. So I talked about how I have this fascination for unusual instruments. An unusual instrument, a rare instrument for me, is like a concentration of extraordinary potential for something new that's unexplored. And I find that completely irresistible. Because instruments have a history, and they have a past, and they have a memory. And I can't write for flute without thinking of the Prélude à la Comédie d'Enfant. It's extremely difficult. But I don't have that problem if I'm facing an instrument that doesn't have that kind of a past or a history. And I find that extraordinarily, vertiginously exciting. So one particular period in history that I find totally fascinating is the period sort of around the Industrial Revolution, when all of a sudden new instrument construction techniques were becoming feasible. And you had this extraordinary explosion of inventiveness in terms of what sort of instruments could be built and marketed and sold and played and so on. There was a profound revolution around that time, starting around the middle half of the 19th century. So there were all sorts of entire families of instruments that were sort of rather hastily invented and built and marketed at the time. And most of them were completely forgotten. Most of them were either sort of commercial failures, or they were later absorbed into more refined or more successful inventions. And a few of them survived, so we know what they are. The saxophone family dates from that period. But there's all kinds of other instruments that just have completely disappeared. So, for example, I was fascinated by things like the A-flat clarinet. So it's an Italian military instrument, essentially, that was basically never used in orchestral music. So the A-flat clarinet is a fourth higher than the E-flat clarinet, and it's this tiny little clarinet. It's like ridiculously small. Like you can't stand it. It's so ridiculous. And so when you're trying to play this thing, it's got a full boom system on it, but your fingers are like this. Like it's actually like the keys are practically glued together. But it's a real instrument, and you can really do things with it. So I got really fascinated by this thing, and I wanted to write for it. And so I had a commission from an ensemble in Switzerland called the Proton Ensemble in Bern. And one of the lovely things about Proton is that every member of the group is a multi-instrumentalist. And they're all extremely interested in and curious about unusual instruments. So for example, the oboe player, who's a remarkable oboist, he plays every instrument of the oboe family, from the piccolo oboe to the lupophone and the heckelphone, everything. The clarinetist will play basset horn, bass clarinet, contrabass clarinet, and so on and so forth. So when I got this commission to do a piece for them, I immediately thought back to what I would call a sound image that I had that had been rattling around in my brain for years by that point. And it was this idea that I would do a piece where there would be a wind section, where all the wind instruments would be miniaturized versions of the standard instrument. Because I absolutely love the sound of high wind instruments in their lowest register. There's slightly off about it. It's not quite the right timbre, it's not quite in tune, it sounds a bit strange. And I love the idea of having three instruments like this. So in this piece, which I'll play an excerpt of, Verification, you have a piccolo instead of a flute. There's a piccolo oboe instead of the regular oboe, so an E-flat oboe. It's also called a musette. And there's an A-flat clarinet. And then next to that, in order to make the thing even more supremely ridiculous, there's a Casio SK1 mini keyboard. Right, so I thought that would be actually quite interesting to take an extremely fine pianist, a really, really fantastic pianist, and make him play this stupid little toy, this completely obsolete, obscure synthesizer. Well, it's not even really a synthesizer. You can't really do synthesis on it. But anyway, this little thing, this keyboard that was briefly very popular in the 1980s. And so the idea there was take this thing, this keyboard, and treat it as though it were an extremely serious instrument. If I could take this thing and really figure out what its limits were and what you could do with it and what all the parameters were, and I spent actually several weeks studying it and looking carefully at all the different possibilities that it had, it turned out that they were actually a lot more vast than I would have thought at the outset. So anyway, so there's a Casio, and then you have there's a cello, which is the only sort of normal instrument in the piece, and it's the only instrument capable of playing in the bass register as well. And then there's a percussionist, and the percussionist plays an array of mostly small, irritating instruments like tin cans and glockenspiel and bongos, cymbals, sandpaper blocks, and so on. So I'd like to suggest that we listen to this piece, Verification, at least the first movement. It's actually written in 4 movements. So it's a rather peculiar piece, even by my standards. And what's basically going on is it's well, you just have to listen to the piece, and then we can see what you think. Right, so that's the first movement of Verification. So one of the things that's extremely important to me, generally speaking, is to listen to the material that I'm working with. And when I say listen to it, I mean listen to it inwardly. And I've developed some ability over the years, anyway, to have a fairly accurate interior perception of what it is that I'm writing and what it is that I want to hear. And I think that's extraordinarily important. Everything that I write down, I have a very precise idea of what it is that I want and what the effect of that is going to be. And so I tend to not write things unless I can hear them, unless I can imagine them. And that's something that is actually a rather painstaking process. It takes a long time, because when I'm starting out a piece, I'm, by definition, starting with something that I don't already know how to do. I'm starting out with a situation that is novel for me, as far as I'm concerned. So I have to confront ritualistically this material that I know nothing about and that I haven't yet tested, and try to do something with it. So very often what will happen is I'll be spinning in circles for a number of weeks while I'm sort of looking at this material from all possible angles and everything that it can do, and trying to make some sense out of it and trying to turn it into a piece. Very often, it's as though I feel as though I were walking out onto a vast beach with all sorts of peculiarly shaped and colored stones, and sort of walking along, and every now and then one of them will sort of glint and catch your attention, and it'll have this extraordinary magnetism and significance and meaning, and you can't explain why that is. It's something that's located in you and in your perception. But occasionally that'll happen, and I'll be really struck by something, by a sound, a register, a particular type of articulation on a certain instrument at a certain dynamic level, and I'll try to do something with that. And all of my pieces grow in that manner, from extremely an extremely rudimentary starting point. So from that extremely basic beginning place, I try to put something together. So in the case of Verification, it was really just a response to the sort of strangeness of these instruments and trying to do something with that. So I always start from the instrument. I try to explore its possibilities, and that has slowed down my production to a certain degree. Because, especially at the outset, I was writing these pieces that corresponded exactly to a very strong interior impulse of some kind. But these were pieces that there was absolutely no practical way to perform. So when I first approached Franck, I don't know if you remember, I briefly showed you a piece for heckelphone and two pianos, which is a completely insane and it's just an insane thing to do when you're 22 years old and you've just arrived in France and you're trying to meet people. It's like, here's this piece that's impossible to play, and that will, that there's a very strong chance will never be performed. But I had to do it because it was like I was seized by this strong inner image of a piece that I wanted to do. And so I always sort of function that way. And I advise against it because it makes your life a lot harder. But the upshot of it is that I have a catalog of pieces that, whether they're good pieces or terrible pieces, I don't know. But at least I know that they correspond to something deeply personal in the case of everything that I've tried to do. So I did that piece. It actually took 10 years to have it performed. But I'm happy, actually, that I did it. And I don't care that it took 10 years. What ended up actually happening with that was we did a CD at Radio France with Ensemble Proton about a year and a half ago. And that was just an obvious choice to put that piece on the disc. So we did, and we did a beautiful recording of it. And it's a piece I wrote when I was 22. It's not necessarily my greatest work, but I was so glad to be able to have a project like that and see it through, even if it took a really long time. And so for a very long time, I was writing almost exclusively pieces like this, where they didn't really fit into any particular institutional situation, right, where there was no particularly obvious way to get them performed. So that probably slowed me down a little bit at first. But I really felt that I had to do that. And over time, I've gotten a little bit better at formulating projects that are feasible on a logistical level, but that also correspond to something that I really want to do. So what I've been preoccupied with over the past few years now, because my concerns have been evolving as a composer, which is just a normal state of affairs. I was teaching analysis for a few years in France. I had a position in Cambrai, which is a town in the north, near the Belgian border. And I had an extremely interesting experience with my students, because we were looking at all sorts of music from different historical periods. And one of the things we actually ended up looking at was the fünf Orchesterstücke by Schoenberg, the 5 orchestral pieces. And I thought, well, they're probably not going to like these pieces, but we'll try anyway, and we'll see what they can make out of them. And interestingly enough, I sort of assumed that the harmonic dimension of the piece would be a problem for them, because obviously, as I'm sure you're all aware, it's a piece that ruptures completely with tonality. And it's not a particularly easy piece to listen to. They didn't care at all about that aspect of the piece. They didn't even notice that it was atonal. It's an interesting thing, if you look at this sort of fin de siècle period, between late Romanticism and the beginnings of modernism, it's not always obvious what's a tonal piece and what isn't. So you have pieces that are nominally written in a key signature, but that are actually completely chromatic, and vice versa. So they didn't particularly care. It wasn't necessarily obvious to them on a purely harmonic level if you were to isolate the chords and compare them to, say, something like, like Wagner or I don't know, certain passages in late Mahler also are quite chromatic. That wasn't an issue. What was difficult for them was the absence of any kind of identifiable rhythmic pulse, the absence of identifiable rhythmic patterns. And I started thinking very carefully about this, and I realized that rhythm was actually probably the most immediate and possibly the most important parameter in music, at least as far as I was concerned. So up to that point, I'd done a lot of pieces that were somewhat abstract as far as rhythm went, or at least you wouldn't necessarily always have an identifiable pulse in them. You would hear gestures, you would hear shapes, but you wouldn't really hear periodic rhythms. And I got really interested in this, but at the same time, I really didn't want to write the sorts of rhythmic patterns that you get in a lot of Western sort of classical music that are really, if you boil it down, you have like maybe half a dozen extremely elementary dance rhythms, and that's where it pretty much all comes from. So I was interested in all sorts of rhythmic phenomena, and I was interested in finding a way to write periodic rhythms, but in a way that wasn't overly simple or overly obvious, and especially polyrhythms. So that's something that actually became a very considerable field of inquiry for me. So starting 3 or 4 years ago, I've written pieces that actually are consciously thought of in terms of the relationship between the material, the meter, the rhythm, and if I write, for example, a 7/16 bar, it has something to do with the way the pulses are divided up in that kind of a measure. So they're not simply abstract containers for X amount of seconds of music. They're actually metrical creations. So I would say that probably started towards the end of Verification, and it started to take off when I had a year of residency at the Casa de Velázquez in Spain, which was a very important year for me because I was actually temporarily free from all sorts of material concerns that normally haunt composers. So I spent the year thinking very carefully about what I could do, about what the next step would be, because I was extremely interested in finding ways to write music that would have nothing to do with development, for one thing, but that would nevertheless have a strong rhythmic component of some kind. And I wanted to know also how you could keep a piece going and keep the listener engaged if you didn't have either processes or directionality or development ideas. I didn't want any of that. I was interested in the material qualities of the sonic objects that I was dealing with. And so this piece was actually quite an important one for me. So the piece I'm going to talk about now is called À propos du concert de la semaine dernière, which translates as with regards to last week's concert, which is a strictly meaningless title. And I love meaningless titles, by the way, because they kind of open up your imagination, and you don't really enter the situation of hearing the piece with any kind of prejudice as to what you're going to get. So I prefer something that is bordering on incomprehensible to something that's like, I'll take you by the hand and we'll come here and I'll show you the forest, sort of thing. So that's what I was trying to get at. So I'd like to play this piece, which dates from 2014. So you see there's all these tiny little rhythmic figures that are disposed sort of like in a mosaic. So you'll have one bar of one type of material and another bar of something unrelated, and so on and so forth. So it's all these materials that contrast with each other and don't necessarily relate to one another in a particularly organic manner, that are sort of shoved up against each other as in a mosaic. And the rhythm of the piece and the form of the piece comes from the manner in which these different contrasts are managed over the course of the piece's duration. It's also a sort of small pocket concerto for piano and 7 instruments. So I'll play this piece. I've got one copy of the score, which I'll pass around if anyone wants to look at it. So I'll just close with thank you. Oh, faithful few. I'll just close with a few remarks. One thing that I'm obsessively searching for is, I mentioned earlier the idea of this sound image. One thing that really strikes me is every now and then you'll hear a piece that strikes you with extraordinary force, such that if you only heard it once, and then thought back on it 5 years later, you would still be able to remember it. You would still remember the impression that it made on you. And that's actually a fairly rare thing. But there are certain things, nevertheless, that are, for one reason or another, extraordinarily powerful and simple, and that really grab you. And one example of that I can think of is the moment in Gruppen where you have that brass chord that moves around the hall. It's kind of a simple idea, and some people have said it's sort of cheaply theatrical and a gimmick and so on, but I don't think so. I actually think that that's an extraordinary moment. And one thing that I've tried to do in some infinitely clumsy way, but at least it's an attempt, is to try to come up with sound concepts that, if you hear them, they actually leave something on your memory. There's a lot of pieces that we hear that are kind of anonymous in a certain sense, or lukewarm. They're kind of shapeless. You hear them and you sort of experience them, and you move through the piece, and then it's like they're gone in a sort of a cloud of smoke. And I'm interested in strong, clear, simple shapes. And I'm really trying to get at that in my music. So there's been a progressive move towards, I wouldn't call it simplicity exactly, but towards paring down my material and finding out what the most important things are, and really just jettisoning the rest. And so that's actually taken me a fair bit away from my initial starting point. So when I was first showing pieces to people in France, they were actually they were quite thick, they were rather complex rhythmically, and there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of material. But the thing that I had to eventually learn how to do was to take something extremely simple and find the extraordinary richness and complexity within it, and then find out what I could do with it. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do in composition, and that's sort of my defining quest at the moment. So I'm working with materials that are sharper, shorter, simpler, and direct, and trying to get a maximum yield out of them, if I can put it that way. So I'll just briefly mention another concern with mine is that I'm not completely comfortable with the standard new music situation, in which the number of people on stage is roughly equivalent to the number of people in the audience. In fact, sometimes it's actually greater. So it struck me that there had to be some kind of way to improve that ratio somewhat. And I noticed that putting content on YouTube is actually extraordinarily effective. One thing that happened to me was I got interested in certain branches of philosophy at one point, and I was doing a lot of traveling, and I wasn't always necessarily in a situation where I could read, where I couldn't read for hours and hours. But there's all kinds of YouTube videos. There are entire courses online. You can educate yourself in almost anything you can think of. You're interested in animal husbandry. Well, there's like a 10-month course. There it is on YouTube. So I thought, well, this is interesting. Nobody's done that for contemporary music. So, at least not that I could tell. Not on that medium. So I started a YouTube channel, which has been an extraordinarily rewarding and fascinating experience, because it's getting a very broad range of viewership, far beyond what I imagined. I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into when I started this thing. And it's absolutely insane. People who never would have even thought to listen to a piece of contemporary music are now doing so completely without prejudice, sometimes with prejudice, and sometimes they hate it. But they'll listen. And if you present it in a certain way, if it's clear and kind of direct and interesting, and you can find a way to make it compelling, then it's much easier to reach people who could be interested in it than if you didn't make that effort. Some people will never be interested in it, and that's just how it is, and that's fine, and you have to accept it. But there's another category that we never think about, of people who could actually potentially be extremely interested in adventurous music and just never get that far. So that's what I'm trying to do at the moment. And that's occupying a fair bit of my time, but I have a real sense of mission as regards that, because I know that this music can change lives. I have proof of that because it happened to me. So I figure if it happened to me, then there's all kinds of people that it could happen to. And it's an extraordinary source of richness. You just have to learn to pay attention. So that's it. If there's any questions.
You mentioned in your writing process you like to know what everything sounds like, and you try to have a mental image of what you write down before. You want this closeness, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you write something down, you don't know what it's going to sound like, or you go into rehearsal for the first time and you're surprised by how the musicians interpret what, like, you thought you'd written something, turned out it sounded like something else?
Well, the score isn't simply a mechanical set of instructions that have to be reproduced precisely by the musicians that you're working with. the relationship between the score and the performer is not that direct. So I'm often surprised by what people do with pieces in that sense, in the sense that they'll necessarily tilt it towards their inclinations and their style of performing and their sensibility. So on that level, yes, I'm frequently surprised by the priorities that certain performers have that might differ from versions that I've already heard. And that's extraordinarily interesting for me. And I treasure that aspect because I don't want a mechanical, sort of correct rendition of the pieces I'm writing.
Well, I guess I want to know is if you've ever written something where you didn't know what it was going to sound like.
I've written things that that are so where the texture is so complex that I'll have a very precise local idea of each individual part, but it's difficult to gauge the overall global effect, and that's always a somewhat difficult situation. I actually just finished an orchestra piece that has a section in the middle where there's an enormous orchestral tutti, and again, this is another sound image that I had where I wanted to have something where pretty much every performer in the orchestra is doing something different. So you'd have this enormously agitated, complex surface, but at the lowest possible dynamic level. So I wanted it to be pianissimo. And it took a long time to figure out how to write that. I actually spent quite a number of weeks on this section, which really doesn't last very long in the piece. So I can't honestly say that I know precisely how that's going to turn out, because there are questions of instrumental weight, especially in an orchestral situation, that are, with the best ears in the world, it's difficult to know exactly, and also it'll change depending on the hall and depending on how large the orchestra is and things like that. But the other thing that I can say about that is when I started out, I was briefly sort of fascinated by this sort of constructivist idea that you get certainly in post-war music and serial music, and also to a certain degree in things like Ferneyhough and stuff like that, where you develop this elaborate pre-compositional strategy, basically, that gives you a situation that you have to react to. It's like you set up these constraints, and then you whatever the constraints produce, you react to that. And so for a very brief period of time, I was actually interested in that, and interested in seeing if I could do something equivalent, because I'm also a poet, and I'm fascinated by constraints in poetry and in language in general, and the sort of extraordinary stimulation that can produce. When you impose an arbitrary restraint on your material, or something completely absurd, like I'm going to write a novel without the letter E, then you get a result that's completely unpredictable in a sense, because the system is going to generate a certain type of surface, regardless of what it is that you might be trying to do with it. So I thought it might be interesting to see if something analogous could happen in music. Is there an equivalent to that in music? And I was listening to a lot of this sort of post-war stuff. But I couldn't get it to work for myself. I just couldn't, and I tried actually. But it was completely alien to my way of working. So I was writing things where I would have some kind of system in place, or some kind of rhythmic grid of some kind, and then trying to build it up layer by layer and so on. And it just never worked. It never worked. Some composers can do it, and it can be like a native language for them. They can be very successful at it. In my case, it really doesn't work. The only thing that I've ever found that works is if I sit down and I close the door and I'm at my desk and I just listen. And that's the only thing that works. So I've stuck with that.
But by that process, do you feel that you're limited by your own imagination? Like you can only write when you listen. Everything is still coming from you. So do you find any external forces coming in? Like you're a poet, are you inspired by? Do you work with text, or do you incorporate some sort of non-musical element into the process of composing?
Yeah, all kinds of things. Absolutely. I'm fascinated by the visual arts. There are painters that I'm obsessed with. Painters that have actually shown me aesthetic dimensions that are so extraordinary that I can't help but be impacted by them. It's very difficult to transfer aesthetic experiences from one artistic domain to another. The thing about music is that it exists in time, and it's practically the only art form whose main medium is time, really. I guess you could make that argument for cinema, but it's not quite the same thing. So So it's very difficult to be fascinated by a painting and then somehow transfer that aesthetic impulse into a musical domain. I don't think it really works all that well. There are composers that are fascinated by architecture and quantum physics and what have you. And okay, why not? You know, it's a big world. You know, why the hell not, right? But the problem is anything that isn't born in a temporal dimension on a certain level has no business being in music. That's really how I feel about it. It's very, very difficult to make that leap.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? I'm trying to think about that. The temporal aspect. Can you repeat what you just said? I'm very sorry.
Well, what is the basic material of music? Really, it's sound and time. So that's it. And probably the time aspect is more important than the sound aspect, actually, in my view. So that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with sort of fields of abstract meaning in music that manifest themselves through time. It's an extraordinary phenomenon, you know. And I can't really think of any music that doesn't engage meaningfully in some way or another with time. I really can't think of anything, you know. So I don't. It's very, very difficult to take things that are fundamentally not temporal experiences, like painting, which doesn't. I mean, I suppose you could say yes, the eye travels here and then there, and so there's a certain sequence in terms of how you actually view a painting. But fundamentally, it's not a temporal art. It's a plastic art. It's a static art. So anyway, that was just a very long-winded response to your question.
In some cases, it might be slightly more complex. For instance, if you think of Marco, for instance, of course, it is static as a material art, but the perception that it engages is not static. You need a special, it puts you in a special temporal experience. So the art itself is not temporal, it's true. The perception will be, you know what I mean?
Yes, yeah,
I think in the sense, and I think that Feldman understands that very well.
Yes, yeah.
So I think that, well, I understand exactly what you mean, especially when you compare to scientific experiences, it's true. But for literature, for instance, or for painting, sometimes you have a perception, especially for literature, which is, let's say, not the time maybe not as important, that's true. But the perception, I know that, for instance, I can think of a kind of poetry, for instance. You have some certain poets who write very short poems, and you think of them for a very, very long time because it's like enigma. So the perception you will have of it will be temporal. This experience, but it's true that in terms of time, that it's ridiculously short.
Yeah, well, that's a very good example. Actually, one thing that I frequently think of are the sort of early Webern miniatures. And these are extraordinary things. The bagatelles for string quartet, for example. So these are pieces that, I'm sure you know them, they're extremely short, right? The individual movements might be 30 seconds long or less. The cello pieces also are like that. And they're extraordinary because if you've actually heard them in a concert situation, they're gone in 2 minutes and it's over, and that's it, and you're on to the next thing. In a sense, it doesn't really work in a concert situation, especially if you don't already know the pieces. You know, the concentration of experience in them is so extraordinary that the sort of habitual relationship that we have with the different elements in a work kind of breaks down. But nevertheless, you can think about these pieces and they unfold in your mind over years in an extraordinary way. It's like Mallarmé in a sense, where you have this incredible compaction of signification in a very, very small space. And they sort of frustrate the normal manner in which we listen to music. But it's actually an extremely fascinating phenomenon. So, I mean, temporality obviously is an extremely vast and complex subject. I don't mean to simplify it, but I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that fundamentally the business of music is music, and I'm trying to deal with elements that are intrinsically musical. But of course, I have a rather wide-ranging practice. I'm a poet. I'm interested in all sorts of things. I'm fascinated by the arts, by architecture, by the world. I love to go out and see new places and meet people, and all of that obviously affects me. But it's far too complex for me to say in what way they affect me. I couldn't possibly tell you. All I know is that I move through the world, and my perception latches onto certain things. And why it latches onto those things instead of other things, I couldn't tell you. Why on earth an 18-year-old living in Toronto would become fascinated by Stockhausen? It's not an obvious thing. You know, most people don't have that experience. So why did that happen to me? I have no idea. So I'm not privy to that information. But you just go with it, and you figure out what's significant to you, what's meaningful, what manifests itself as something that you can't live without, and you follow it. And that's the way I've always worked with my music, for better or for worse.
But one thing that I do find between your poetry and your music is this concentration of material that I think is very akin to poetry, and the economy of language that you have in your writing. In music that probably has, for me at least from the outside, a more obvious link to poetry. Right?
Yeah, I think that's true. The stuff that I've published has been fairly condensed and very slowly worked on, and it matures in a very slow manner, like my music. I'm not someone who's capable of writing 10 pieces a year. I've never been able to do that. So I write all the time, and I work hard. I get up at 6 in the morning, and I work really hard, and I do a very solid work day every day. But I actually produce fairly little, considering the amount of effort I put in. And I think the reason for that is that my work, for whatever reason, needs to go through this lengthy maturation process. I don't know why that is. Some people are much more spontaneous, or their work manifests itself to them in a form that's maybe more easy to put into a piece. I don't know. But in my case, I'm rarely satisfied unless I'm able to take that time. It doesn't mean necessarily taking years to write a piece, although it could. What it tends to mean is that I usually write everything twice. So that's actually slowed down my output somewhat. I usually have to write the piece the first time to know what it is, because it's a process of discovery. I don't know what the piece is until I've written it. I discover it through the act of writing the piece. And then once that's done, and I have a certain degree of distance from it, and I've heard a few performances, then I can go back and have a different view on the material, a different understanding of what its possibilities are. And I might say, well, you know, that section could have been a little bit longer, or this could have been more optimal, and I'll go back to it and I'll improve it. And so that certainly has slowed down my output somewhat. And it's the same thing in my writing as well. I mean, I've published 2 books so far, and each one took about 5 years. So, you know, I'm not in any hurry. But, you know, that's fine. I love the process.
Thanks for the talk. It's great. I was drawn to your initial your interest in these sort of more rarer forms of instruments, like you mentioned the haplophone and the flugelphone and clarinets. And your experience working with some of these musicians that sort of specialize in that. I'm curious if the emphasis at a certain point shifts towards those particular people, and it arrives at a point where you can't necessarily distinguish between the person and this particular instrument that they're playing. Where you want to maybe perhaps just keep on writing for this person, for example.
That's a great question. I do have that relationship with some performers, actually, where I have such a strong identification with their way of playing that I can't help but think of them if I'm working on a new piece. There's a few people, actually, that I can think of. But as regards the rare instruments, it's not quite that straightforward, because usually it's up to me to find a practical solution to have the piece played, because very often these instruments are not necessarily in circulation, or they're not easy to find. So in the case of the A-flat clarinet thing that I mentioned earlier, I actually wrote for that for the first time in 2004 in a quintet called Music with No Edges. And I wanted a really, really high clarinet part in the sort of piccolo range, and that was the only way I could do it. I knew this thing existed, but I'd never actually seen one. So I just wrote for it in the score, and we ended up recording it in Toronto, I think 6 months later or something like that. And it was up to me to find the damn instrument. So, I mean, we searched absolutely everywhere for an A-flat clarinet. And at the time, I had far fewer resources and you know, a far smaller network than I have now. So it was infinitely harder. And through an extremely convoluted series of circumstances, we ended up finding one. Some 90-year-old guy in a little village in New York State had one. So he gave us this A-flat clarinet that probably hadn't been used in 40 years, and we ended up using that for the recording. So there's no regular relationship with performers who play these things because there aren't any performers who play them. And so every time that piece has been played, or Verification, and both of those pieces have been played multiple times now by different ensembles, I've gotten better at sourcing the instruments, so it's not as much of a problem now as it used to be. But there's a Swiss guy who has a beautiful A-flat clarinet who has regular business from me. So.
Maybe I have one question, but I don't know if I don't know almost the response, but I would like to. You spoke a lot about, I think, as David pointed, your interest for different forms of, let's say, unusual colors and instruments, being to the instrument. And you're a part of a generation where a lot of young composers like you were at one point, let's say, tempted by introducing so many, unusual techniques and what we call extended techniques, which was quite popular. And you did not do that. You did not go that much in that direction, I think. And you find a special color in your pieces. It's obvious each time you listen to them today. So it's very clear. And you were never tempted, apparently, to go beyond a certain, let's say, direction in that way, while you're part of a generation who did. So how do you position yourself toward this kind of global, let's say, interest for extended techniques and so on that you did not use that much?
Well, it's not a question that
I don't
I...
know if it's clear.
Yeah, no, it's very clear. It's not a question that I ask myself because fundamentally I love pitch. And it's that simple. I love pitch.
That's what
It's not complicated. Some composers are able to do extraordinary things with almost no pitch content. And that's wonderful, and I love that kind of music. And I actually listen to a lot of things like that. And I listen to a very, very broad range of things. But as far as my own practice goes, I personally can't do without it. I need it. And, like everybody, I'm sure, well, not everybody, but like a lot of people from my generation and earlier generations, I grew up writing hundreds and probably thousands of chorales and fugues and things like this. And I developed actually a real love of pitch and the things that you can do with it. Now, obviously, my stuff is not involved in classical tonality, but the idea of conducting voices and having contrapuntal textures and having independent sort of layers going on in a piece of music is something that I'm really fascinated by. And I really see music as a collection of elements that you can't dissociate from each other. And I probably got that actually from Varese and also from Stravinsky to a certain degree, where you can't separate out the pitch from the instrument and the register, the dynamic level, the duration, the articulation. All of these things work together simultaneously. And that made an extremely strong impression on me. I remember I spent a great deal of time analyzing Désert by Varese and just completely fascinated by what he could do with two notes at the beginning of the piece. There's only two notes, F and G, spaced a major ninth apart. That's it. But it's the most extraordinarily interesting texture in terms of all of those different parameters working together. So there's a lot you can do. And pitch is never just pitch anyway. I mean, it's not that simple. Pitch is something that's tied to a certain pitch on a certain instrument in a certain register at a certain dynamic level and so on and so forth. So I don't see it in an abstract sense. And actually, something that is certainly the case in a lot of Anglo-Saxon cultures is there's a sort of obsession with pitch organization, which I don't have. And I'm not interested in pitch class theories and stuff like that. And, I just want to run away and jump out the window. It's really unbearable. And there's a guy, Alan Forte, who's published a book on Webern, which is like he manages to misunderstand everything. Like, it's phenomenal. So no. So he's dead anyway. So that's fine. So. No, it's so much more complex than that. Pitch is not some abstract thing that you can just, it's not that simple. So it's really tied to a specific instrumental sonority. And an A flat played in the lowest register of the clarinet is not the same thing as the same pitch played on a vibraphone. It's two completely different objects. So that's how I see it.
Well, okay, because that response I was waiting for. The only thing that I think a part of your originality amongst the people who are the same age is about how to find new colors without requirements, without digging too much in the field of extended techniques, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And well, you found your own solutions. But that's what I wanted just to point that part of the original approach is about that.
Well, it also depends on how you define an extended technique, though, because there are non-standard instrumental techniques in my pieces. There just aren't that many of them. But generally what happens is I'll have an instrumental situation where the writing may be fairly classical in a certain sense, but there will be just one element that throws it off and that changes the color of everything. So, for example, I have a trio for oboe d'amore, harp, and viola. And in the central section of the piece, the oboe d'amore is playing double harmonics. And it changes absolutely everything. So sometimes just taking one simple element like that, it can be very subtle. It changes the way everything else sounds. So that reminds me actually of a remark by Richard Strauss, who once wrote for a quartet of saxophones in the Sinfonia Domestica, which you can't hear. You listen to the piece and where are the saxophones? It's like they're completely absent. You see them on stage, but you don't hear them. And someone asked him, why would you bother writing for 4 saxophones in this piece when there's 10,000 instruments on stage and you can't hear them anyway? And he said, well, I would know if they weren't there. So, yeah, they slightly color the sound of the orchestra, and that's enough, and it takes you into a different dimension.
Going a little bit further in that, what I find fascinating is that, not in a very positive sense, is that actually it creates, or it can create, I don't know if that's been your experience, strong reactions in conductors or artistic directors that they'll rather have an electroacoustic element than having an instrument that is not part of the ordinary, because they don't understand this profound reason that it changes the color of the instrument as much as an electroacoustic sound can change the color of the instrument. And it's considered more like a luxury or a special thing to request, a harpsichord in an orchestra or something like that.
That's true. Yeah, there are real logistical problems involved in writing for these things, and I'm aware of that, and that's why it becomes my responsibility to find solutions when I write for these things. Sometimes the sort of threshold of what constitutes an unusual instrument is actually quite low for certain orchestras, right? So, for example, I did an orchestra piece last year where I needed a piccolo timpani and a 5-octave celesta. And I show up at the rehearsal, and there's a 4-octave celesta, and nobody says anything, and they're just playing it an octave higher. That really bugs me. Because, it's not impossible to get the correct celesta, but the idea that it wouldn't matter and that you could just play it, in a different register, that really bugs me. But if I were writing for, I don't know, a tenor therusophone, and it was an issue, then I could understand. Yeah. But
for instruments, well, I know you play the oboe, probably the musette. For instruments, for example, in the clarinet, how do you go about exploring? Do you find recordings of A-flat clarinet and things like that, or how do you go about it? Or do you go get together with a friend?
Well, my first encounter with the A-flat clarinet, I had an idea of what I wanted. I didn't know precisely what the instrument was like, so I just wrote the part and then hoped for the best. That was my first experience. When I wrote for it a second time, by that point I was more able. I was more in more of a position to be able to get an instrument and work with a player. So I actually got a clarinetist, and it was at Darmstadt actually, and we had this clarinet, and we just took a few hours and just sat down with it and went over it. And I got him to play the most banal possible things, before even talking about multiphonics or quarter tones or anything like that. I just said, play me the Mozart clarinet concerto on the A-flat clarinet. And that was really interesting, because then you understand really all of the things that are wrong with that instrument very quickly. It's not in tune. There are certain key combinations that are extremely difficult. The registers are not equal. The high register is 50 cents higher than the low register, so you have to adjust it constantly. And that's actually, if you're dealing with these kinds of non-standard instruments, that can actually be an extremely interesting way to approach them, is take some really familiar object from music history and transpose it to that instrument and see what happens. So that actually taught me a lot more about what that instrument can and can't do and what its qualities are than if I had sat there, with like a book of 400 multiphonics and got him to play every single one. So, but there were some practical things in terms of working out glissando fingerings and stuff like that I had to work out.
One last question about the piece that you just came to us, apropos.
Mm-hmm.
There is something I wanted to have you speak about. Was about the notion that I had when I was listening to this piece again about something which has to do more or less, I guess, in my perception, with ornamentation. And you never speak about that. And I think that, well, let's say melodic writing, kind of special phrasing, I guess, kind of special breathing in what you're doing. I think it's original, so it's great. But I would like maybe to speak a little bit about this notion of kind of ornamentation, because of course it's not ornaments necessarily on the page, but it has to do with a kind of rhythmic ornamentation, let's say. And I would like maybe to say a few words, or am I totally wrong?
Well, that's just a function of harmonic rhythm. So very often what I do is I work with sequences of chords or harmonic materials. And usually, especially more and more now, the harmonic rhythm is actually fairly slow. So that's one major difference between what I'm doing now and what I was doing 15 years ago, is my earlier pieces have an extremely fast harmonic rhythm. It's just constantly turning over all these chromatic pitches. So now I work with a much more restricted range of materials that I choose extremely carefully. And I tend to stay on each one for a longer period of time. So in order to constantly reactivate the listener's perception and also the potential of the objects and the chords and the harmonies and so on, I have to have different strategies to do that. So one way of doing that is rhythmic variation. Another way is timbral variation, obviously. There's all sorts of things you can do. But a lot of the rhythmic figures are invented as a way of animating a harmony, basically, and finding an inner life within that harmony. So, for example, the beginning of the piece, the piano is really just squashed down into an extremely narrow register. Basically, the piano occupies a register of approximately I can't remember precisely. I think it's maybe a major sixth or something for the first 20 bars of the piece. And so the hands are like this. But the idea was that you would have certain pitches that would be for the left hand and certain pitches that would be for the right hand, and you would create a polyphony within this compacted cluster-like space, and find a way to carve out some kind of architecture within that space that would have some kind of polyphonic meaning. So basically it's about taking these spaces, these harmonic spaces, animating them, figuring out how long I need to stay on them, and figuring out how long it takes really to go through its potential until I need to go on to something else. And then the energies that creates also. Because I always want the piece to be pushing forward in some way or another. My pieces are not static. So they're not developmental and they're not process-based, but they're not static either. They have a certain forward momentum to them that I always try to have. So it's important to build that dynamism into the material somehow so that it's always pushing on to the next thing. And I suppose ornamentation, to the extent that we can apply that term to what I do, is one way of doing that.
Okay, it can be heard like that.
Yeah.
That's my feeling.
Yeah.
So what do you think at the end? The last question before the famous reception. What do you think? It's fine? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.